The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the challenging second day of Sesshin here at Mountain Gate in February 2022 in northern New Mexico. The second day is challenging for many years for most people doing Zazen, because initially, unless we're in a monastery doing practice really much more frequently, we come into Sesshin and there's a sort of a startup period on day one, getting ourselves settled in, getting our mind focused a little bit more clearly. And then day two. What happens in day two is really an incredible opportunity, because it's showing us where we are caught and offering us the opportunity to be free from being caught in discomfort, in challenge, in dukkha, which of course can range anywhere between utter boredom and deep agony. That's the Sanskrit word that's used to describe the condition that is essentially the human condition. But underlying this ordinary human condition is the potential for utter freedom and joy, freedom from this dukkha. But the challenge is that in order to become free of it, we have to walk into it. And I think, for some reason, the 23rd Psalm has come into my mind a great deal recently. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the valley of the shadow of death, thou art with me. I fear no evil. Anyway, when we do the second day of Sesshin, or whenever we encounter our stuff, we are walking through the valley of the shadow of death. And there's no one outside of us that is going to be there with us. But we ourselves are possessed, are inherently, there's no way to separate it really, free, perfect, whole, and complete. And we just don't realize it. And that's why we go through life with challenges in our life. It doesn't mean that there's not pain and suffering in the world. There is. Right now, there's several wars going on. There were just two incredibly powerful earthquakes and aftershocks that were almost as intense as the earthquakes. And the aftershocks can actually do at least as much damage as the earthquakes themselves. The first earthquake was 7.5, which is quite intense. The second one, a few hours later, was the first one was 7.8. The second one was 7.5. And then the next day, there was a 6.7 aftershock, and the aftershocks are continuing. There have been apparently at least 40 aftershocks. And once a building is in a fragile state as a result of being shaken so violently, that then a further earthquake, an aftershock, can pull it down if the first one didn't. And moreover, the region in Turkey that this set of earthquakes has taken place is a part of Turkey that has not seen an earthquake in the lives of most of the people who live there. It's been decades since there's been an earthquake. They're much more common in other parts of Turkey. And now the death toll is over 3,000. It's going to rise higher, both because of the collapsed buildings and also because of the deep cold. It's winter there, like it is winter here. And so many people are going to end up dying caught in the debris of hypothermia and just freeze to death. It's really an extraordinary situation, and one of many that the world has been experiencing in the last several years. If there was anything to motivate us to find that innate freedom that we have, it's things like this. Of course, we don't live in Turkey right now, but there are other things going on. Mass shootings in America, all kinds of violence, the challenge that people are facing, unable to deal with the isolation that was required around the COVID-19 virus pandemic. In China, finally, people erupted, breaking down barriers so that they could see each other, so they could be together. Human beings need human company. And this was largely removed during this main course of this epidemic. And the result of the Chinese breakdown in rules and finally opening up and allowing people to be more freely active has resulted in a great deal more coronavirus deaths in China as a result. For most people, there are challenges. For most people, there have been challenges since we were born. Even getting born is a challenge. And most people reach a point when they are dying where they have clung to what society has established as the only way to be happy, which is to buy things and to rise in the ranks of your work, to be famous, to be known, to be recognized. Buy the right lipstick and you'll be happy. It's kind of topsy-turvy. There are so many historic stories of people who had nothing and yet were free. There was a man, a monk, he was really a master in ancient China, who lived in a tree, not in a tree house, in a tree. And one day a layperson came along and said, "Master, you're living pretty dangerously up there." And the master shot back, "Layman, you're living more dangerously than I am down there." What did he mean? The tree master had come to such a profound awakening that things were not a problem for him. Even if the earth caved in, even if his tree collapsed with him in it, it would not have been a problem. There is a story of another, and this is a recorded story, both of these are recorded stories in China, of a master who was, again, deeply realized and famous enough, although he didn't try to be famous, he just was an effective teacher, that word of his fame, word of his popularity went all the way to the capital, and the emperor demanded that he come and teach the court. The teacher, understanding that people in the court had no interest in Zen practice, and he would be abandoning his serious students and their potential for coming to awakening with his guidance if he went and was a famous Zen master in the court of the emperor. And so he said no. Well, emperors in those days didn't like to have people say no to them. And so the emperor said, "Okay, if you won't come, then you're dead." And the master asked for a week, a reprieve, so that he could write down what he understood of Zen practice and leave it behind for his students to have some level of training even after his death. And then he presented himself to the court to be executed. And before he was executed, as he bent down with his hands tied behind him and the executioner was raising the sword, he expressed a poem that said that the sword slicing through my neck is like the spring wind, no problem. And it is said, of course, this is, I'm not sure this is even physically possible, but it is said that when his head was sliced off, which was a classic way of executing people in China, even into the 19th century, that instead of blood spurting from his arteries, something like milk came out. At any rate, he had no fear of dying. He had no fear of being executed. What is it that he understood? What is it that the priest living in the tree was trying to express to his lay person? Well, on day 2, the caught places in our minds begin to show up. These don't show up if we'd only practice superficially. So in that sense, you can take heart if you've got challenges on today, because it's showing you where you're caught. And in order to become free of that, we have to see where we're caught. It gives us this opportunity to work with those caught places then to become free. And how to work with them? By tuning into the energy that is expressed in our bodies. That if we go up into our heads, into words, we'll say, my back hurts, or I feel really wretched right now. We may not have any obvious reason to feel wretched, but it'll be from some kind of background noise that most often comes from our childhood, but not necessarily. We're taught by society that, as I said in the very beginning, if we do certain things that this society values, we will be happy, happily ever after. And people keep trying and keep wondering why. There is still chaos, there is still pain, there is still suffering, there is still dukkha. There are still murders, there are still earthquakes. Well, the earthquakes would happen regardless. And we're not feeling fulfilled. What's wrong? What's wrong is that we have lost touch with our true beingness. And I'd like to share again some of the words of Mitra-roshi, pretty recently expressed. He sent this out to his students to encourage them this year, since he himself has been asked by his doctors not to travel as much and to sort of calm down on his extremely intensive schedule. His commitment is to bring as many people to deep awakening as possible. And so he has virtually, well, I won't say destroyed his body, but come close to it. Through the extremity, he allows himself no more than 3 hours of sleep at night. And that has resulted in, at the age of 82, his not being able to stay awake 100% of the time. And he'll fall asleep in Sanzen with you. He has fallen asleep, this was years ago, 40 years ago, he fell asleep falling out of and fell out of a tree more than once. When he was a kid, he used to climb up in trees. And his sister, when asked by somebody, why Why is he doing that? Said to try to see what was right in front of his face. So he has really dedicated himself extremely to helping his students come to awakening. But he is aware, I'm sure, that sooner or later he will die, and more likely it's sooner rather than later. He's had heart issues, and this is why his doctors are telling him to kind of slow down. Don't travel so much. He's been flying all over the world multiple times a year to lead sesshin in many, many different places, especially in Europe, where he has sitting groups in every single country in Europe, including in Russia and including in the Ukraine. The Ukrainian Sangha looks actually pretty big, which is no surprise, given the suffering that's going on in Ukraine these days. So he is very dedicated, as I said, to helping his students come to awakening, to free themselves. And this is what he has offered. Training is about seeing that which cannot be seen. And that's why we cannot use words. We cannot use our intellect. We cannot search for it in the way we would do in a school class. It's impossible, because what we are searching for is necessarily beyond words. And this is part of the frustration for many people. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just sit for 45 minutes and then we begin to open, and then after another hour or two, bingo. Well, it doesn't happen that way. Mitra-roshi himself has said, the first 10 years are difficult. The next 10 years are even more difficult. And then it gets easy. I would say it's not quite that extreme, not in my experience, but maybe he is trying to encourage his students to sit through whatever came up, because it's worth it. To continue, when our mind becomes deep and quiet, we can perceive the whole picture. We need to put our life on the line, which means to really give ourselves to our practice. And then we can see that which is invisible. That is human's ultimate appearance. He has an interesting way of speaking. That is human's ultimate appearance. The first one who realized this was the Buddha. If it were about that which you can see, then science would suffice. But there is a certain end to our life. When the end comes, what happens on the other side? You cannot learn this at school. You cannot write about it or read about it in a book. It cannot be expressed in words. You need to experience this for yourself, this truth. There is no other way. That is why we sit. And it's difficult to whatever degree it's difficult, because of what we have kind of shut out of the picture. And we shut things out of the picture because they're not comfortable. In some cases, they're quite painful. And so we don't want to feel them. Who wants to? And yet, that energy is still buried in our bodies until we allow it to release. And to release it, it is important to walk right into the feeling of that energy. Whatever it is doing, jumping up and down, electrical senses, electricity running up and down our arms, coldness in our chest, whatever it is, whenever it is, it's important to tune in and explore what's it really feeling like. And when we tune in fully, there is no difficulty around it. It's when we tune in halfway with one foot in the feeling and the other foot standing outside trying to be safe, it isn't going to work then. And of course, it definitely doesn't work if we try to turn our back on the feeling, the sensation, because then it remains buried and driving us behind the scenes. I was just recently editing chapter 13 in the book that we're going to be putting out, hopefully soon. And one of the subject matters is Hakuin's extremity in his early days of practice, where he just tried to force himself into a kensho, striving, driving, tension producing. And yeah, he got his kensho, but it wasn't as deep as he thought it was. And not only that, but the stress of the striving, the intensity of the driving, the intensity of the tension that he built. At one point, he wrote about, with tongue pressed against palate and with your fingernails digging into your palms. That's how you practice. Well, that's what made him sick, that way of practicing. It requires a relaxed body, but not a floppy body. We want to relax into the practice with curiosity, with a perplexity. How can there be all this suffering, and yet there is also, just barely out of reach, this immense freedom, this joy. Every single one of us has something that I call a river of joy running deep within. And we can open to that if we do the work. But it's work that we have trained ourselves to turn away from. And that's why it's so difficult. Once we get a handle on how to work with it, the tuning in, even when it feels frightening, even when it feels anxiety producing, even when it feels like you don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, but you do it anyway. And it's amazing. It's miraculous, the difference. The fear of going into those challenging feelings is usually more difficult to deal with than the feelings themselves, ironically. But if we are to become free of them, opening to the full catastrophe, as I guess it was Zorba the Greek said at one point, we need to do it. And the irony of it is that when we open to what we expect is going to be a full catastrophe, it's not anywhere near as catastrophic as we had thought it was going to be and feared it was going to be. So walk right in. It's day 2. Here's your wonderful opportunity to really open to these things and to become free of them. Because you can, and because it's worth it. I think that's enough. It's a sort of a short teisho at this point, but let's go back to sitting and work with those felt senses that we otherwise would prefer to run away from. Because walking right in, welcoming them into our conscious awareness is the doorway to freedom from them. So I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.